I'm Jeanne Blackburn. I'm talking today with Antonio Tobias Mendez, who prefers to go by Toby. He is a Maryland sculptor. Toby, hi.
Hi, how you doing, Jeanne?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank you.
We're going to talk a little bit about your wonderful career here, mostly in Maryland, as a sculptor. Now, you've lived most of your life in Maryland, but you weren't born here.
That's right. I was born in Denver, Colorado, and only spent a short period of time there.
And then what?
Well, most people will know the family name through my dad, Tony Mendez, and he was a CIA operative, and we were stationed overseas. So a fair part of my childhood, those 7 years, were spent over in parts of Asia, in Okinawa, Japan, and Bangkok, Thailand.
So spending those early years in a different culture, did that have an effect on your perception of art?
On art and in life, you know, being exposed to other cultures, one, as a child, you learn very quickly what it's like to having a feeling of not belonging. And also, you know, there's an expression about the best way to defeat prejudice is to travel. And so I was exposed to quite a bit during the Vietnam era, and that culture and living in that and then coming back had quite an effect on me.
Mm-hmm. Were there people there that were specific influences on you?
I wouldn't say so. I would say more the culture, in particular Bangkok, because we lived in the city in a very turbulent time. And it was just living in that culture and being kind of in the minority, which I think there's a great many benefits to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It must have been an adjustment to come back to the States, though.
It was. You know, when I went into 5th grade here for the first time in the United States, it was the first time I went to a school on American soil, and it was quite a big change. The kids were quite different. The kids overseas, you really felt like you were amongst a very diverse culture. Kids from all over the United States or Americans or English-speaking countries. So coming back here, it was like a microcosm of what I experienced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was there someone who mentored you when you came back to help you kind of readjust to, or I shouldn't say readjust, but adjust to American living?
Not in particular, but I would say that, you know, living in Bangkok, a family of 5, we really had to rely on each other. We were a very close-knit family. So I really looked to my parents and to my siblings. So my parents were probably my best mentors.
They were both artists.
That's right.
Tell us about each of them a little bit.
Yeah, sure. My father grew up always being an artist. He was a painter. He was hired as a graphics artist, but was always extremely creative, not just in painting, but in a little bit of sculpture. My mom ended up being a decorator, but before that she painted and she did sculpture. So I have creativity around me all the time.
Was your mom the creative influence on sculpture?
She was. The very first sculpture I ever saw created was created by her, of me. And it was the first time I saw somebody working with clay and creating figures. And very quickly I adopted the clay and started creating.
Most kids gravitate toward painting or drawing, but you zeroed in on sculpture.
I did. You know, I did also, in the beginning I started with drawing and eventually drifted towards sculpture very, very early. When I was about 9 or 10 years old, I started carving wood. And then later on I picked up painting before I went to college. But sculpture always excited me.
Mm-hmm. What was high school like? What did you, was that sculpture? Did you have an opportunity to do something during high school with sculpture?
Yeah, I should say going into high school, my middle school teacher saw that I was carving jewelry And she recommended me for the Maryland program for gifted and talented arts. It was the summer program. And that was the first time I went into formal studies of sculpture, and I did that for 4 consecutive summers. High school was just like most people's experience in public high school. The arts were kind of on, were not the first priority, not the most popular thing. So I played sports and so forth, but I always secretly was creating, producing my own work, hoping to make that my dream.
You had a commission at a pretty early age. How old were you?
Well, when I was carving jewelry, I was always taking orders, actually from my teachers, and making money on the side doing that. My commissions really started when I was in college. I would think I was about 23 or 24 when I started doing those. And the first formal commissions for corporations started when I was about 23, 24.
So you decided after college, you were in Chicago in college.
Yes, that's right.
Is that right?
That's
okay.
right.
All right. And you decided that you really wanted to pursue this as a career?
Yeah, actually it started much earlier than that. It started when I was about 15 or 16 years old. I focused on it, and I had a sculpture that was of the tennis player Bjorn Borg that I was sculpting, and I was doing it to be fired, so it was sculpted hollow. And then it started to collapse about midnight. This was during the summer. And I recall fighting it through the night until about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I saved it. And consciously thought, can I do this as a living, this roller coaster? And that's when I really decided that's when I wanted to do this.
Okay, you've brought up a couple of interesting things here.
Sure.
Maybe you could explain to us what is involved in creating a sculpture.
Well, it depends on the final product. The majority of my work ends up in bronze. So I start with clay, and I sculpt directly in clay until if I'm working with a client, they've finalized it and I've done the final edits. And then once that's complete, it's not a permanent material, so I have to go through a series of mold making, which is essentially taking negatives of the clay, creating another positive in wax. If I want to make a bronze, I make a mold off of that bronze. Off of that wax, and melt the wax out to pour a bronze. So clay to wax to bronze if I'm doing a bronze. Back when I was doing stone, I would do a clay, do a plaster, and then use the plaster to carve my marble model.
Complicated. It
is, and it's tedious, and it's
time-consuming.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking because there's a lot of learning. So there's a lot of disappointment and a lot of failure, and learning from failure, and just building on that.
Is there a disaster you can share with us?
Oh gosh, there's too many.
Aside from the one that you said was collapsing in the middle of the night.
I'm sure I could go on for hours about doing that. I mean, that's the thing is my very first sculpture, I didn't realize you couldn't leave an armature in something that was going to be fired, and it just turned to dust. Oh. And the next one, I learned how to build it so that it wouldn't fall to dust. And you build on those experiences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how did you establish your career?
Well, I should kind of back up a little bit. When I finished high school, I wasn't ready for college, I was tired of school, and I had an opportunity to go to California and to work with John Chambers, who is known for being the makeup sculptor who created the Planet of the Apes. Mm. And so it was actually an opportunity for my parents to see if I was really dedicated and going to do it for a living. And John was incredible. Academy Award winner, Emmy winner, star on the Walk of Fame, everything, most awarded at that time. He was a great mentor, and he prepared me for the career of being an artist. And he also recommended me to go to Chicago to pursue the career of being an artist. So I went to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago.
Why didn't you stay in Chicago? Why didn't you stay in a big city?
Well, my experience in Chicago led me to Spain for a year, and I came back to finish up in Chicago. And I really thought I was going to stay in a large city, maybe go to New York, stay Chicago, maybe even go back to Madrid. And around that time, my mother passed, and I came home really realizing I didn't get to know my parents. And it was an opportunity to come back home, set up a studio, and start my career. The other thing I realized through a friend who was a professional sculptor is I saw he was away from Spain for just a couple of years. And when he went back to Spain, it took him about 3 or 4 years just to reestablish himself. So I knew I needed to get started, and Maryland was home.
Did that make it easier?
It's never easy, but you know, I was surrounded by supportive people, yes, and it didn't in the sense that I had to establish myself as a sculptor, and I didn't know any sculptors in Maryland, and so I just kind of had to figure that out and eventually find other artists.
You had space in the house you now live in.
Well, in the house that I lived in then, we had just built a studio when I was finishing high school, my father and I. It was a painting studio and a wood shop that I could do sculpture. And then when I finished school, my father and I and family members and friends expanded that studio into a gallery, into a full sculpture studio and so forth. My original sculpture studio in the house was just a little 8-foot by 8-foot little room in the basement. So it really grew. You know.
It did.
Yes, it did.
How do you describe your work when someone says to you, "Tell me, what do you do?"
The easy answer is I'm a traditional sculptor, but have a contemporary approach to design and site design. And then when they ask for more detail, I would say that I work with the figure. I work in traditional materials like bronze. The other thing that I would say defines me, makes me different than the other sculptors, is that I become involved in the site design. So projects that I've done, a lot of times I've designed the sites or collaboratively worked with architects to design the settings as well as the figure.
Public spaces?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I would say a lot of that influence came from my parents. My mom being a decorator, you know, would think of, you know, a designer's approach to architecture is, you know, you look at all of the color schemes, you look at every detail and make sure that it all works cohesively. My father's background, because we built the house and we built the studios and all of that, is I had a pretty strong foundation in construction. So I was curious about all of those things.
You have an incredible body of work. It's varied. It's not just in Maryland. Tell us if you have a couple of favorites that might be familiar to Marylanders.
Yeah, if I focus on the Maryland sculptures, nearby in Washington, D.C. is the Navy Memorial. And I contributed 3 bas-relief panels to that memorial. And that really set the course for my career.
Was that one of the first?
Very first. I was about 25, 26 when
That's pretty amazing.
I took that on. It was, and kind of shocking. When I was interviewed, I had no idea what it was for. I thought it was going to be bronze plaques for an office. I didn't know it was for the National Memorial until I cleared the interview and they said, "Do you want to go see the site?" And they took me to Pennsylvania Avenue to the construction site, and that's when I started that. That project, as I mentioned, set the course for the others. I learned the importance of homework and research and being prepared and being able to present and sell the ideas. I learned when I was hired, they had let 10 people go because they couldn't meet design criteria. And so that was intimidating. And going in knowing, okay, what worked and learning how to present before committees. Usually committees of former Navy that had zero art background. So being able to articulate to, the everyday person a design in a design direction was very important.
Were you the youngest person involved in that?
I was at the time, and I would say most of the sculptors were, 50 years and older. There were a couple, there was one in his 30s, one in her 40s, but most people were fairly well established. So you asked me what were my favorite works. The first large public work that I ever won in competition is the Chesapeake Waterman, or the Oyster Tonger Memorial, that's in Calvert County, Maryland, and part of Anne Marie Sculpture Gardens. And that set the course for my career doing large work. So the Thurgood Marshall Memorial, which is in front of our State House in Annapolis, came after that. Work for sports came after that. Really, those set the tone for what would follow.
How many sports figures have you sculpted?
It's easier for me to say how many sports organizations I've worked for.
Okay.
So the first was Nolan Ryan for the Texas Rangers baseball team. And then years later, I did work for the Boston Red Sox for Fenway Park. I created 2 projects for them for Fenway. And then that led to working with the Miami Dolphins, and then eventually with the Baltimore Orioles, which is one of the larger projects I've taken on. I did all 6 of their Hall of Famers. But I've worked for Johns Hopkins. I did Coach Bob Scott, which is on their lacrosse grounds. And I've done recently Shirley Povich and Walter Johnson for Shirley Povich Field in Cabin John, Maryland.
You've also sculpted some women.
I have. Most notably Maggie Walker, the first African-American woman to charter and be the president of a bank in Richmond in about 1903 is when she did that. And, that's the world of who our subjects are. Women is really where we are right now, and it's exciting to think.
In a perfect world,
Yes.
what would your dream sculptor or dream commission be?
When interviewed and someone asks me, why do you want this project? What's meaningful to me is to take on projects that are meaningful to others, that will stand the test of time. So I think of, I've always wanted to do a monument to Martin Luther King, to Frederick Douglass. I have a great interest in civil rights. I'd love to do Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Subjects that I think will reach and touch the hearts of future generations. Works that are meaningful.
What's involved in applying for a commission?
There's a great variety.
Are there differences?
Yeah, there's a great variety, but the typical for an open call is they send out either a request for qualifications or a request for proposals. And you send a portfolio of your works digitally these days, a resume, and then a written statement, and then they narrow that field down to usually anywhere from 5 to 3 for interviews, and then sometimes you're actually presenting designs for that project. And usually, typically, that's a small maquette, so you're doing a figure that's portable in size and gives them a true understanding of what the final design will be.
It's a process.
Yes.
You've had an incredibly successful career.
Yes.
Did you assume, or did you think that it would be this, or did you ever second guess yourself?
I never second guessed myself. I knew I was going to be an artist. I knew I was going to be a sculptor. I just didn't know how I was going to get there. I know when I went to school, I felt like I had 4 years to figure out how I was going to make a living once I finished. Because my fear was having to go get a real job. And so I was driven from day one My freshman year, I was fortunate to meet classmates that had a really broad experiences and professional experience, and I gleaned quite a bit from them. And then in my sophomore year, my goal was to be in foundry doing bronze work. I actually didn't have the prerequisites for that. But I made a deal with the instructor in foundry. If over the summer I created 20 sculptures ready for foundry, would you let me in? And of course he laughed, and then in the fall I delivered 20 sculptures ready to go. And I was just very hungry and very driven. And then in my junior year I was hired to be a teacher's assistant in foundry because of the experiences I got that second year. So I was constantly looking to make this a career. So in that junior year, that's when I got my first commissions, and they were blind. One was a phone call to the foundry asking for a bronze sculptor who could do figurative work, and I said, you got the guy, and I had a portfolio to back it up, and was hired by Multiple Sclerosis, the chapter in Chicago, to do their awards. And at the same time, I also did a portrait relief for Valparaiso University. So right away, I was hitting the ground running before I graduated.
So is there some advice you would give students?
Well, you know, the best advice, I guess, a one-size-fits-all is that, you know, check your ego at the door, be a good listener, that you're really there to listen to your client, no matter what field you're in, is really to be a sponge, to take it all in, because you never know when you're going to absorb things that are beneficial. I always took my mentors very seriously and listened to advice of my elders, and those have always been great lessons that I fall back on, especially when it's not going smooth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So be a good listener would be the first, and then check your ego.
Toby, it seems that there's always something on the horizon.
Yes.
What's next?
Well, what's next is what I'm working on now. I'm working on two different projects, one for Hagerstown, Maryland, which is of Clara Barton, and the other is of a Marylander, Lefty Kreh, who's known in the fly fishing world as the greatest of all time, and that's for Frederick. The Clara Barton is ready to go to the foundry, I believe, in January of this coming year. And
where will that be?
it'll go in Hagerstown, very close to City Park near the museum. And the subject is actually Clara Barton giving aid to a fallen Union soldier during the Civil War. And the significance of the sculpture is that in Washington County, Maryland, Clara Barton was for the first time was given permission to be on the battlefield while the fighting was going on. And one of the stories that she tells is giving aid to a soldier and realizing that there was a vibration or a twinge in her sleeve, and that the musket ball had passed through her sleeve and had killed, mortally wounded that soldier. The Lefty Kreh is interesting. It's going to go in Frederick in Baker Park, and will actually be placed in the lake, which I think is kind of fun because people will really discover it in nature, a man fly fishing, and it should catch them by surprise and capture the curiosity to want to learn more about Lefty. And that's the goal of a memorial, is to make people curious.
Well, they both sound wonderful.
Well, thank you.
We'll look forward to seeing them when they're installed.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you.